Welcome back.
Welcome to Decision Space, the only show that takes place right here in the space between the turns in your favorite games. I'm Jake Friedman.
And I'm Brendan Hansen.
And this is the podcast about decisions in games.
And on today's episode, we're talking about paradigm-shifting games, at least for us. These are games that Jake and I have played that changed the way we think about games. So we're just going to go through, it's going to be a much more, I think, casual conversation than a lot of our episodes, an opportunity for us to talk about games, to talk about how we think about games, and to talk about how a number of games we've played changed the way we think about how games can be, which I hope will be an interesting, fun exercise to kind of delve into why these games stuck with us and why they made us think about games differently. I'll try, and I think Jake will try, to talk about the decisions in these games somewhat where that's relevant. And I will say in some cases, it might not be relevant at all. And that's just the rub on today's episode.
Yeah, I'm interested to see where this conversation goes. We were supposed to come up with 5 each. I've come up with 3 so far, but I'm hoping that I'll be inspired by Brendan and maybe come up with 2 more as we talk. We'll see about that. Before we get into this conversation, let's just do a little bit of housekeeping at the top. First and foremost, as is tradition on Decision Space, at the end of the year, we rank every game that we played this year in a year-end episode, and we love it that our listeners can be a part of this episode by submitting your ranking of all the games we've covered in deep dives as well. And you can do that by going to decisionspacepodcast.com/rankings. We also have a link to that Pub Meeple ranker in our Discord. So easy to find. You'll just compare a bunch of games against each other, choose the one that you think is better. You can rank all the games. You can rank only the games you've played, however you see fit. And we'll include that list in our episode that's coming up next week, Brendan?
I believe so.
Yeah.
Which will be really exciting. We have more than 40 people who have rated some or almost all of the games so far. And if you haven't played all the games, like Jake said, that's okay. You can either just rate them based on interest, or you can even take them out of the rankings.
Yeah, I think there's like a way to like X and say, I haven't played this.
Yeah.
Either way is fine with us.
Yeah. And I can't wait to delve into it, reflect on an awesome year of games. Also, speaking of, I guess this is a tough segue because I was going to say enhancements, but there's really no ranking enhancements. We'll just be reflecting. But we've enhanced our Patreon. How have we done that, Jake?
Yeah, so I found out that it's really easy for me to just upload a raw video of us recording, talking to each other to our Patreon. So if you've ever wanted to know what Brendan and I look like while recording this episode, in this case, today, you'll see that we're wearing the exact same outfit. But normally it's probably not going to be like that. We'll see. But yeah, so basically it's just a new, perk for our Patreon supporters. We're so grateful for anybody who chooses to support our show in that way. It allows us to not only continue this show, but hopefully do bigger and better things in the future. Now you can see us talking, and also it's unedited. So as people have already noted, there are times pretty big difference between the unedited version of the podcast and the edited version that you're hearing every week in your podcast aggregator. The edited version's better, but if you like the unfiltered us and ums and
seeing Jake and I laugh at each other, seeing our backgrounds, I have something nice in my background, but you have to go to decisionspacepodcast.com/Patreon to learn more.
Well, that's enough about that. But thanks again to our patrons as always. And lastly, here in the housekeeping section, we want to say just look forward to next week, the ranking episode, and then we'll have one more episode this year. It'll either be released on the 27th or on the 3rd. So we'll have one other planned episode. We're planning to take a break. We're not sure when that'll be at. And that's going to be a state of the show episode, kind of thinking about the past, present, and future of Decision Space. That's just going to be a time for us to authentically reflect on how the show's going. And we would love, again, for listeners to share some of their own insights about this. So if you're interested in weighing in on that, we have a discussion thread open on our Discord, and that would be the place to participate in that.
Awesome. Well, thanks for letting me know what you think of our little project here. And for now, let's get into episode 149 of Decision Space. That's a big number.
Yeah, it's kind of nice how that worked out with our year end coming on 150. But yeah,
Yeah,
149 paradigm shifting games. Let's get into it. Brendan, what is a paradigm shifting game?
yeah, I think we kind of covered it already because this is such a, a succinct, small topic. But I think in this case, what we're going to call a paradigm shifting game is really just any game that we've played that has changed the way we think about games in some meaningful way.
Okay.
So it's something that a game that we've played that's challenged our underlying assumptions about what games could be, what games should be, what games might be, and really made us think through how board games can exist. I think a cool thing about board games for me and sort of playing them throughout the course of time, that's like saying,
Who are you? You said that like you're 1,000 years old.
back when I played Mancala in 1500 BC. No, but it's just that I think pretty consistently one of the most fun things about board games for me is every time I think I have an understanding of what they could be or what they are, there's a new game that comes along and sort of says, no, there's so much more. The flexibility of what board games can be is really cool. So I want to talk about that.
How important is it to you that we only are talking about board games here?
Well, seeing a list of games, I think, Decision Space is ultimately a show about tabletop games, right?
Right.
But
Yeah.
when there's exceptions, there's exceptions. So
Okay, great. Excellent. Moving on from that, my other follow-up question is like, when I was thinking about this topic, and I think part of the reason I had trouble coming up with a good answer to paradigm shifting games is because I was really conflating this with our gaming histories, which is another episode we've done previously. It's been a long time, so I don't think it's a problem if we're covering similar ground here. But when I think of games that change the way I think about games, I just think about games that are like pivotal in my life and growth. Like we've talked about, Magic the Gathering was the game I played throughout my adolescence and probably changed the way I think about games more than any other. Is this different from that, or does that fit in here too?
I think for me it's slightly different, Jake. When I was going through my list of games, a game that popped in my mind is Keyflower. So Keyflower is one of the first sort of strategy Euros I ever played.
Right.
I learned about
that's
it.
That's a great example because like I was also thinking about that. Like the first Euro game I played, like that changed everything.
Totally. But for me in this case, right, I think the reason why I haven't put Keyflower in my list of games is because when I first played Keyflower, I think it's so much aligned with what I wanted a game to exist as. It like fit with my like envisioning of, oh, I wish a game existed like this. Then I played Keyflower. I was like, this is a game I wish had always existed. So it fit with my definition of what I thought games could be or ought to be or how they might exist, right? Not to be is way more of a value judgment than I ever want to ascribe here. But it just like, I played it and it's like, oh, I'm so glad that someone else made this. This is exactly the thing I wanted to exist all along. And now I get to own it and play it all the time. But it didn't really change how I think about games.
So there is some element here of like innovation and also of like, I didn't know a game could be this way.
I think so. And we're also not saying, right, like this isn't an episode that's trying to talk about all board games and
right,
talk
like,
about
these
paradigm
are
shifts
the
within
biggest
design trends.
Yeah.
Like we're not going to talk about Dominion this episode.
Right. Okay.
As like deck building changed everything.
Yeah. Okay. Gotcha. All right. Well, I think that gives people a little bit of background of kind of what we're going off of. Do you want to get us started with your first one on your list?
I would love to. So I think the place I want to start is Antoine Bauza's 2010 release, Hanabi. Hanabi was sort of a paradigm shifting game for me in a couple ways. I had played Pandemic first, which was the first co-op game I played. And I'm not putting that here because I don't think it was really a paradigm shift for me to see a co-op game, but Hanabi was a real paradigm shift. This is a card game in which you're playing with other players and you're trying to play a series of suits of cards in a certain order based on the value. And you're just trying to play cards in the right order. But the trick is that you can't see your own cards. You can only see everyone else's cards, and you are giving clues or basically, you're giving clues to your team members, the other people playing with you, about what cards they might have. But you have a pretty limited communication set in how you can communicate in terms of the color or the suit that a card is or the value that a card is. And I think for me, the huge thing here that just blew my mind so much really is the card mechanism, right? I think of playing cards as just there's something that you hold that contain hidden information. But my assumption all along was always just that hidden information is for me. And Hanabi has this beautiful, simple twist that changes everything. That the hidden information is the cards in your hand are not hidden to everyone else, but hidden to you. And I think Hanabi's sort of like a magic trick in a way. It's the kind of game that if you've never seen it and you've never played it, playing it is completely mind-blowing. At least it was for me and many of the people who I showed it to over the course of a few years. But I think as time went on, I played Hanabi less and less. I'd seen the magic trick. It was a really cool thing. And I think it changed the way that I think about games because it's such a clever inversion of that sort of core basic assumption. Have you played Hanabi, Jake?
I haven't played Hanabi. And
You've never played Hanabi?
I've played Hanabi, and as you're sitting here talking, I'm trying to think of like any game that I have played where like you're the one on the outside looking in. I played that like phone app game where you like put a word up on your head, on your forehead, and like maybe it's like people or something, and you're like, am I a musician? And they're like, no. Like, am I a politician? You know?
Yeah.
But I'm trying to think of beyond that, no. But so taking it to a decision space lens, how does that change the decision space for you? I mean, is this more just like a novel inversion, or like are there things there in the decision space that stand out about Hanabi and this inversion that you pointed out?
That's really interesting. I don't know that Hanabi is so much one where it's changed the way that I think about decisions in games so much. It's a pretty tight structure in terms of what sort of information you can provide. You're almost solving a puzzle with everyone else at the table. You just have limited information. So there's oftentimes you can take risks in this game. Sometimes you have to. So one of the major decisions, right? And the risk is because you don't know what's in your hand, if you're forced to play a card, sometimes you're just taking a risk based on the limited information that you have. And you're also going against a timer. So you're incentivized to make progress without always getting more information. So it didn't really change the way that I think about decisions in games, just more so the way that the structure of games can be. And I think a lot of the games that I'm going to talk about are about like game structure and components as paradigm shifts for me.
That's great. And I think that's a good segue to the first one that came to mind for me, which is Richard Garfield's Keyforge, which also changed the way that I think about the component of cards. And if you aren't familiar, Keyforge is a unique deck game that came out originally in 2018 with this gimmick or hook that instead of buying a booster pack of cards, you would buy a complete deck that was one of a kind. It would be generated by some kind of mysterious algorithm to spit out a deck that you cannot add or subtract cards from. That's your deck that you can play with. And theoretically, they're going to be balanced against each other.
And it's the only deck of that kind in the world. No other deck with that set of cards will ever exist again.
And it has a unique name and unique card art on the back. A ton of stuff, which I think, while it may seem gimmicky, and many people certainly have called Keyforge as such. I mean, Brendan and I will argue forever that there's a ton of strategic depth and value to this game. It is anything but, gimmick only. I think that's just some really, really cool stuff. I think it gets into interesting, murky territory with, the recent emergence of AI. I don't want to open that like can of worms fully for, what that means for the future of game design. But what it did open my eyes to, and I guess switch a paradigm for me, was that not every single aspect of a game has to be intentionally designed by a person. Like there's other ways and interesting things that can happen when sort of like the pieces are kind of set up and then are whatever, the algorithm kind of takes it away. Does that make sense, Brendan, where I'm going with this one?
Yeah, no, it absolutely does. In some ways, it's sort of like it takes this sort of like variable random setup and then just extrapolates it to physical components that
Yeah.
exist,
And
which is really cool.
we've seen games since Keyforge has come out that have taken this even further than just creating a list of cards. I mean, Keyforge did in later sets had like enhancements where you could get a unique version of a card that's like powered up in some way. Soulforge Fusion is a similar style of card game that kind of allows you to mix and match packs of cards. And I think almost all of those cards are like in some way changed by the algorithm. So there's like thousands of possible cards you could get instead
Yeah.
of like couple hundred in a set. And other, I think, less successful examples of how this could be applied to board games and that type of thing. But yeah, I think that idea of sort of an algorithmically generated aspect of a game is not anything until I saw it in front of me that I ever considered could be a part of game, and to have it be a part of a game that I, have had just such good times with the Keyforge makes me excited about kind of the future of this technology and maybe other technologies in board games as we move forward, as polarizing of a topic as that is.
Another cool thing about Keyforge, Jake, is, most games, right? If I tell you to go buy the Castles of Burgundy, you just go buy the Castles of Burgundy. And what
Yeah.
you get is the Castles of Burgundy. When you sit down to play the Castles of Burgundy, you're playing the Castles of Burgundy. If I tell you, Jake, I love Keyforge, you really need to go play Keyforge, you can't get my version of Keyforge, right? Like, my experience of Keyforge is unique to all of the decks I own and all the decks that I play against. And so in a way, it sort of highlights this. Keyforge is a game, but it's a system, and we all own a piece of the game of Keyforge as it exists sort of like intellectually within the world, right? It's broken into all these disparate parts. And I think for me, one like really interesting paradigm shifting element of Keyforge is just that idea of of how you can never have the exact same experience of me of the game as me, right? Like, even your experience of certain cards is going to be completely shifted because what decks they end up in the combination with other things is going to shift how you think about specific things. And I think it underscores in a way and highlights and illustrates how, I don't know, just how sort of innate and unique our own experiences of all games we play are, even though Keyforge kind of like underscores that by giving us all different pieces of the same game.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. And I guess the last thing I'm kind of lingering on Keyforge, as I said, I don't have as many to go on, but there's no other game on this list that, at least as far as I know, that the designer set out to like reimagine a paradigm, right? Richard Garfield set out to create a, kind of a collectible card game model that would push back against the existing collectible card game model of people who have the most money can just go out and buy all the best cards and have the best decks. So like, I think Richard Garfield called it sort of the rich kid problem, where you have an inherent advantage over somebody else, and kind of set out to create a new way of doing things. We can argue about how successful that's been in Keyforge, but it is really fascinating, sort of a designer explicitly taking on a very pervasive paradigm and trying to do it in a different way. So I think Keyforge, for me, jumps off the page as sort of a paradigm breaking, shifting game.
Yep. Okay, awesome. So my next paradigm shifting game is a game by Reiner Knizia. Does release in 1995. This is not the first Knizia game I ever played. That was Tigris and Euphrates. Or actually, it might have been Indigo. But this is High Society. High Society is this light auction game in which every player starts with the exact same set of currency cards that range in values from pretty small in denomination to quite high. And you're going to use those cards throughout the game to bid for points, more or less. You might also be bidding for negative points that you don't want to win the auction. And then the twist of High Society is that at the end of the game, whoever bids the most money cannot win, because they are no longer within sort of the theming of the game, no longer really wealthy, right? They've squandered their wealth. And to truly be a member of High Society, right, you should still have some wealth there. I think for me, Jake, High Society was a paradigm shifting game for a couple reasons. I think it's the first card game that I played that didn't really feel completely like a classic card game. It was a card game that was using cards to really accomplish a different type of game in terms of it being a card-driven auction game. It also has that rules twist where you could teach the entire game. You just teach the whole game. You save in your back pocket the rules twist, and then you say that at the end, and it recontextualizes the whole game. So I think for me, the paradigm shift is of learning to play high society, of loving high society, of thinking it's so interesting and not being able to let go of it in my brain, is this idea that not all rules have equal consequence for the game state or the game objectives. That sometimes the best games are created or crafted by balancing just on one pivotal rule that recontextualizes the whole decision space and makes every single decision you make more nuanced, more interesting, and more engaging. And that sounds obvious, right? But I think a lot of the games that I played growing up, games like Rummy or Spades or Risk, I don't know, almost lack that sort of design nuance in a way. And I think that this was one of the first games that I played when I really got into hobby board games that I sort of could fully grok that idea and sort of sit back and marvel at it. So for me, learning high society made me completely reconsider how game rules can impact how we play games. It seems so obvious. This is a big one for me.
I love that. I think the way you talk about kind of like the rule of having different weight in high society versus a game like Risk.
Yeah.
You know, like the rule that sticks with you, the rule that as you're learning the game makes you excited to play.
Yeah.
The way I heard you talk about it almost sounded like punctuation. Like in high society, the rule book has an exclamation point, where in so many other games, it's just flat. It's just rule, and you need all these to play it. So I think I haven't thought about games in that way before, but I think that's like a fascinating idea, and certainly one that we've seen Knizia kind of master and bring to the fore. And now I think that idea has sort of lives in a bunch of other games in some way, of like almost like I'm thinking of. And when I was early on in the hobby, the first thing I did, or one of the first things, was just like watch every video Shut Up and Sit Down had put out.
Sure. Yep.
And I remember their coverage of, I think it was Marco Polo, and I hope Voyages is a Marco Polo. I hope I'm not getting this wrong, but sort of the idea of like one of the best parts about that game is how fun it is to teach the game. And then you get to the end and you say, and everybody has unique player powers. And then those powers are just like crazy. And like they're a very different style of game than high society, but it's like similar in like the exclamation point rule.
Yeah.
Like here we have a very standard Euro game with this like massive exclamation point on the unique player powers, which is something, you know, in both of these are games that I love, totally different games, but I think you're onto something really smart here.
I think Knizia is really good at that too, that sort of design where he has these sort of workhorse rules that create a regular framework, right? And then the star rule, the one that you can't wait to utter. Yeah. I don't know.
Cool.
So for me, High Society is my second paradigm shifting game.
Okay, cool. I'm going off the beaten path here, Brendan, and I'm going to take us outside the realm of board games.
Okay.
To the realm of video games. And I want to talk about a little game called Super Smash Bros. Melee for the Nintendo GameCube. I think released in 2002?
Right?
I
think it's 2001.
Let me Google it.
You're probably right. 2001.
2001.
No, yeah,
Damn,
yeah,
dude.
yeah.
Nice. Okay, well done. I tip my cap to you, sir.
Thank you.
Okay, so the reason I bring up Super Smash Bros. Melee is because this was a game that I loved as a kid. And then a game that I, eventually I got the Xbox 360, and then I was not really playing my Nintendo GameCube as much. But then I came back to in like post college. I came back to my hometown, and some of my friends at the time were like really into Super Smash Bros. Melee, and so that was kind of the point in my life that I got really into the other Super Smash Bros. Games. But the reason I bring up Melee is because that summer or the next year, I was watching with some friends the Evo fighting game tournament Super Smash Bros. Melee championship round. And it was this massively exciting event because, like, for the first time in 8 years or something, a character other than Fox or Jigglypuff took first place at like a super major event.
Okay.
And so I guess the takeaway here for
Wait,
me,
what character was it though? Marth?
it was Marth, yeah.
Okay.
So it was Marth, and I think I'm maybe getting the details not exactly right. Maybe a Falco or a Peach.
Sure.
Oh, Peach had definitely won because there was a really top level Peach player at the time. But anyway, it was like the first time Marth specifically had won a super major level event in like 9 years.
Yeah.
And it caused like basically the Super Smash Bros. Melee character tier list had to be like changed for the first time in 8 years or something like that. And that right there is what is so exciting to me, or so that I found so fascinating to me, is sort of this idea that like I don't want to say balance is like overrated, but it's more that like we don't know what is balanced basically ever. Because given enough time in a closed system, players, in enough agency, right, enough tools, like this isn't going to be the case with, Connect 4 or whatever.
Sure.
But if there's like enough agency, like players will continue to innovate, find new ways forward. And as long as, you give people the tools and you give them an ecosystem to play in, like they will find a way to like advance, change the game, develop new strategies. So I think that for me changed the way I think about balance in games, and it sort of makes me, just not. I don't want to like say I discount out of hand, but you hear a lot of people just like say things online like this isn't balanced, or like this character is overpowered, or this end game scoring is like too punishing.
You
Like,
have to play this opening. It's the only opening that works.
right. It just make like I think because of that moment, like that game and my experience with it, it like honestly makes me more often than not just kind of like discount those remarks out of hand. I think, we've talked about balance a lot, and like there's probably elements of truth to it, probably like for a new player, or
Sure.
whatever. But yeah, so that's why I wanted to bring up a video game, because I think it's relevant and applies to this topic in board gaming as well.
Interesting. So the specific paradigm shift was around depth specifically.
Yeah.
And the ability for games to sort of, for the popular assumption of games to be wrong in some ways, or
Depth
to be
and
more
balance.
nuanced than presented.
I think that balance and like given depth, balance is always going to be changing.
Cool. Okay, so my next one, we're going back to board game land. I didn't even. This is another question potentially. What's
you
it?
and board games?
I know, right? What the heck?
Branch out.
I mean, one does wonder if we should do more of an episode on video games at some point. But
our 1,000 listeners all screaming like, "No, I talk about board games."
Yeah. Okay, so in 2010, I talked about a game that Antoine Bauza designed called Hanabi. This like massive game that was this popular breakout hit that's still, I think, really played by a lot of people. But remarkably, he also designed another major hobby game that released in 2010, Seven Wonders. Talk about a banner year for a
What
designer.
A year, yeah.
Seven Wonders and Hanabi. That might be one of the best years.
Yeah, well, back then there were only like 2 or 3 games released
published
year,
every
so
year.
it's like, yeah, they all became huge, right?
Yeah, totally. So Seven Wonders is probably the 3rd or 4th board game that I played once I got really into hobby board games. And I think this is skirting the line, Jake, for a game where it's sort of like, is this a paradigm shift, or is this just a game that's historically important to your experience of board games? But I think for me, there's a couple of things about Seven Wonders that set it apart and really did make it a paradigm shift for me. So Seven Wonders is a drafting game in which each player gets a hand of cards dealt to them. They're going to pick one of those cards to play to their tableau in front of them, and then they're going to pass the rest of their cards to one of their neighbors. And play continues this way until essentially all the cards are chosen. You're working to collect resources. You might be using those resources to build additional buildings in future round that might get you flat out points. Might be working towards having wars with your neighbor based on these sort of military symbols that you get. Working towards maybe a set collection game in terms of science cards that you can draft, where if you get enough of them, at first they're not worth very much, but if you get these larger and larger sets, they can just gush points across the table. So one of the big things that was a paradigm shift for me about Seven Wonders is the sort of, I'm going to call this extractive game design. So Seven Wonders, in a lot of ways, Antoine Bauza, I believe, has talked about how he liked drafting Magic the Gathering, this way of playing Magic the Gathering where you can take booster packs, open them up, pick a card from them, pass it to another player playing in the booster draft, and slowly through doing this, you collect a set of cards that's the only set of cards that you can use to build your deck for that night's tournament. It takes a lot of investment from the players. It's not a casual experience because you have to have a fairly good understanding of the cards there in the pool. So Seven Wonders sort of like extracts this meta gaming element of playing a game of Magic the Gathering, a way you can structure playing Magic the Gathering, and says that could be a game. And I think that was really mind-blowing for me in a lot of ways, or paradigm shifting for me, to use the language of the episode, in this idea of you can take the fun thing about playing a game and make that the game. So I think we see like challengers do something similar with tournaments, that tournaments are intrinsically fun. So challengers just sort of says, yeah, we'll just make the tournament the game in a lot of ways. There's a little more to challengers than that. Obviously, there's a lot more to challengers than that. But I think for me,
challengers fits in to the can
with
fit
that
in this
idea.
category too. For that reason, I think that's really well said. Yeah.
Yeah. So that just sort of spun my brain of like, what other fun elements of the structure of games could be extracted to think of a way games could exist. I think two other things about Seven Wonders contribute to it being a game that sticks out to me as a paradigm shifting game. One of them is, now feels kind of obvious, but the sort of simultaneous play of games don't have to be something where you just take turns. For whatever reason, a lot of my game playing up to this point, okay, it's my turn, I'll take my turn. Jake, it's your turn, you take your turn, especially in the hobby game space. So to have a game where you could play up to 6 people or up to 7 people and everyone's making their decisions at the same time, that we're in sync, we're not synced up by taking turns, I think really did kind of blow my mind when I first played Seven Wonders. It's sort of like, oh my gosh, the number of decisions happening at a given time on the table is so high. I think there's reasons why that works really well in some cases and doesn't in others, but at the time it was very paradigm shifting for me.
Yeah.
And the final thing. Oh, sorry.
That really resonates with me too. Sorry. Do you want to finish your thought?
No, you go. And then I'll say the final piece of why it shifted the paradigm for me.
Okay. That resonates with me. An early Euro game, maybe the first Euro game, when I was sort of in the phase of like, you're telling me board games are fun now? Phase of my gaming was Puerto Rico, and that had like a similar thing where it has like a leader and follow mechanism. And I was like, you mean I get to do something on everybody's turn? Like, okay, yeah.
That's awesome. You've been shamed because you've never played Hanabi. I'm going to take some public shame. I've never played Puerto Rico.
Okay.
I feel like,
you know what? I have no shame, and I don't think you should feel bad either.
I want to play Hanabi.
I also haven't played Seven Wonders.
I still can't believe. How many times am I gonna? Oh my god!
You should try this podcast.
Try it over the break.
I should. And it's funny that you said that about like the draft being, and I can't wait to hear your final thing. But it's funny that you say that about the draft being like something that kind of drew you to it from Magic, because like I'm the opposite. I'm more so then when I was like getting into games than now. But there's still like a back of my head a little bit. It's like, a draft is like not the game. The draft is what you do so that you can like play the game of Magic. That's
so interesting.
I feel the same way about like for like decades, like years and years of my life about running, because I'm like, you don't just run, like you have to run to get in shape so you can play like other sports.
Soccer.
Yeah, exactly. Like I'll chase a ball, but I'm not just gonna go run for the heck of it.
That's so interesting, Jake, because when I learned about Seven Wonders, I literally thought, wow, I can buy a game where I can draft multiple times and not have to pay for the draft every time.
Yeah.
It felt like it was like the best. It was so novel. I couldn't believe it. And it was going to be a way for me to be able to draft with people who wouldn't play Magic with me. It's like the best thing ever.
Just make a cube like a normal Magic degenerate.
I didn't even know about cubes when I played Seven Wonders, but I should have. The final thing about Seven Wonders that I think contributes to it having this sort of place in my mind as a game that shifted the way that I think about games is it has a neighbor mechanism. So you care about what the player to your left is doing, what the player to your right is doing, for a couple of reasons. One, you care for a conflict, that war mechanism that I talked about. It's very simple. You're just going to build cards that give you these military symbols, and then at the end of each round, you compare to your left and to your right. Whoever has more will win a set number of points depending on the round for winning that conflict. And then there's another one where you can trade for resources that the player to your left or right has. And to do that, you just say, I'm using this thing of yours, here's some money. So it's not hugely interactive, but all of a sudden, you do care about what just the player to your left is doing and just the player to the right. And I think that that's interesting. That's novel. I don't know that it's paradigm shifting, but for me, what was totally paradigm shifting about that was that it felt like any given game of Seven Wonders, there were these little microcosms of games being played around the table where I didn't exactly know what was going on sort of across the way between the sort of three people who I wasn't interacting with, but I saw they were having fun. And to me, that felt so thematic of this sort of Seven Wonders is very abstract. It's very, very abstract. You're just collecting cards. You have one of the Seven Wonders of the world assigned to you. But to me, it felt like a civilization existing on the table where it's sort of like over here, yeah, I know what me and my neighbors are up to. I don't really know what they're up to, but they're part of this world and they're collecting the same things we are and participating in the same thing. It gripped me and it hooked me in a way where what was happening at the table and the shape of play was so different than a lot of the games I had played before that, where I sort of knew and had to know what everyone was doing to understand the game, for the game to be played, everyone kind of had to always know. But Seven Wonders says, no, that's okay. Just you'll play your game and you'll kind of play it with your neighbors, and they'll play their game and they'll kind of play it with their neighbors, and your neighbors might be their neighbors' neighbors, and that's okay. It sort of helped me think through how flexible the structure of board games can be.
Yeah. You ever play Sidereal Confluence?
No, but I really want to.
Yeah, try playing that at like a full player count, and it's like the people across the table from you are like speaking like an entirely different language. You just have
amazing.
no idea.
Yeah. Oh,
We don't have that kind of color cube over on this side of the table.
what's that resource? Yeah.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Okay, I'm going to jump in with one that I'm going to use here because it's a nice segue. It wasn't one I came up with previously, and it's one I explicitly said I wasn't going to talk about. But to bring it back to Magic the Gathering just really quickly, one of the ways that this made me think about games differently, playing Magic taught me that like games are a toy box in and of itself. Like I love playing draft in Magic. I love playing Constructed. But like when I was a kid, my favorite thing, like I would go to Friday Night Magic, lose immediately. It was single elimination back then, which is like
single elim.
Yeah, it was just
Wow.
single limb, and it'd be like at least like 40 people like every night. So it's just like this crazy bracket. So you go play, lose right away.
Wait, how much did people pay to go home after one game? Probably like $8 or something.
No, I think it was free.
Oh, it's free.
I don't remember paying anything.
Gets you in the store. Okay.
Yeah,
cool.
I think just playing for like FNM promos or something.
Cool.
My favorite thing is I'd go lose in the first round and then play like these like massively multiplayer games of Magic, right? And I just think that is something that maybe like I don't think about enough with this hobby now that I'm like an adult with disposable income and I can just like get a new game to play every day. That like unlike, different forms of entertainment, like a movie, book, video games to some extent, like games, you can do whatever you want with them. And inside, any given box are countless ways you can house rule and just play in different ways that are going to be fun and satisfying. I think like, for me and probably just so many other people, Magic was the first opportunity for me to become kind of like my own little game designer in that way. In playing with the structure of games beyond just obviously you get explicit tools to like create the agency you want to play with in Magic. So yeah, I think that fits into this point in the conversation as well. So I'll choose Magic as my third one.
And by that you mean, right, I can build my deck however I want to build my deck within whatever the card set is, so I can choose to have different tools than other players.
Yeah. And on top of the fact that, and then when I have my deck, I can play it in all kinds of different ways.
Different
like,
ways.
you know, Commander is like a major format in the game now that was like player invented, player driven.
Yeah.
I remember when I was a kid, Two-Headed Dragon was like a popular side event where you'd have like 40 life shared between you and a partner and play like a 2v2
I liked
match.
playing that way. Yeah.
Yeah,
That's
like
fun.
that kind of stuff, you know?
Yeah.
Very cool.
I think Magic the Gathering also, it's like natural that it gets mentioned in this episode, because if we were doing the list of games that shifted, that caused a paradigm shift in games generally, Magic is absolutely on that list.
Yeah.
If it's a top 3, it's on the top 3. It's just one of the most important paradigm shifting games of all time. For basically what we talked about with Keyforge, so I'm glad it ended up here too.
Yeah,
this idea of like the game is bigger than the box. Okay, back to Board Game Land again. Jake's cheating. Jake's always cheating. Okay. Okay, so I've covered a lot of old games so far, including my list, 1995 to 2010s. I'm going to jump to a 2018 release, and this is Wolfgang Warsch's The Mind.
I love this when I saw this on your list.
Did you? Yeah.
Hell yeah.
So this takes this idea that basically a lot of my responses have been this idea that for me, when a game really shifts how I think about games, it's doing so by challenging my assumptions about the structure of games in general. So if I thought I knew what simultaneous play looked like with Seven Wonders, the mind says, no, you don't even know. You don't even know what simultaneous play is until you've played The Mind. There's no turns. We're not going to be synced up. You just play the card at the right time. Interestingly, if you've never heard of The Mind, this is a game played. It's also a co-op game with a deck of cards with values 1 through 100. You're dealt a hand of cards, and it won't be all 100 cards dealt out in a given round. You're actually going to play through a series of rounds in which you're dealt an increasing number of cards to your hand, and then you all have one objective: to play your cards in ascending order. So if I have the 1, the 17, and the 50 in my hand, and Jake has the 9, the 25, and the 100, I should have written all those down. But basically, I have to play my cards. I have to play, my 1, and then Jake has to play his 9, and then I need to play my 17. And the only thing we have to go off of is our minds, because you cannot speak. So you just, through playing this game, have to get a sense for about how long you ought to be waiting before playing whatever the next value you have is. So you're reading people. You can't even really, depending on how a given group plays, you can't really gesture or make faces. You really are just trying to look at the quiet agony of those at the table and see who's hurting more. And then maybe it's probably their turn. But you're trying to sync up.
Yeah, it's so, I think it explicitly says like you're not allowed to give any cues whatsoever. But that's also the trick of the game, because that's literally impossible not to. Like we're all, you know what I mean? Like we're all so good at subconsciously reading the expressions and sort of like inner thoughts of other people that, like, without intentionally gesturing, you're still subconsciously communicating so much to the other people at the table.
You can also, in The Mind, depending, this plays 2 to 4 people. I think it's also an exercise in just like how much you can read in someone's eyes, just like without saying anything, just looking directly, making eye contact, and seeing, how much you're suffering versus how much they are, and if you should go. The Mind also, so I think for me, it's a paradigm shift because it's of that structure, just the idea of, okay, there's no turns. We're not playing simultaneously, like in the same concept as the Seven Wonders, but we're playing simultaneously. What's that?
Is it just a real time?
It's just completely a real time game. Yeah. But it's real time in a way that a lot of real time games aren't also, Jake, right? Because a lot of real time games,
it's just like, I'm going to roll this dice as fast as I can.
Exactly. A lot of real time games are just like, whoever's the fastest is probably going to do better. Right. It's fast. It
doesn't actually care about time at all.
Yeah. You might have a group where it takes an hour to play around at The Mind because you're just all calibrated that way.
That is my absolute favorite The Mind experience, where you like get down to the end and 2 people have cards left and they're just both refuse to play it. So they just do it for like full minutes of just silence and staring at each other. And as the third party, you're just like watching and just like, I don't know. It's like this is just amazing.
I love when that happens though, Jake, and then it turns out that one person's holding the 99 and one person's holding, or the 98 and the 99. So there's still the 100 hidden somewhere. And then they get it right after sitting there for 2 minutes just doing nothing. Yeah.
There's something amazing like that will happen in The Mind where you just like, navigate a run of like 7 cards where it's like all within like 12 numbers of each other or whatever. All,
Yeah.
it's like 7, 8, 13, 14, 15. Like what?
Yeah.
Like how do we even do that, man?
Yes.
I love
Yeah.
that so much. So I agree with this one. I think like for me, the paradigm shifting is not about like the timeless quality of it. And I mean that in terms of like
The structure
the structure, not that it's like a game that will
is
stand the
timeless.
test of
Yeah.
time. But it has to do with the fact that like there are like it's the best game I can think of that you can explain the rules in 10 seconds.
Yeah.
You know
It
what I
is the
mean? Like
best game that exists that you can explain the rules in 10 seconds,
there's
probably.
basically
Yeah.
no
That's a
rules
great way of
at
putting it.
all. And
But there's
on
so
top,
much game.
yeah, right. There's no rules on top, and it's all game. And like the other thing that's kind of paradigm shifting is, a lot of great games, and you kind of like hear this sentiment around the hobby that like, a good game designer like doesn't forget that the players are like the most important component or whatever.
Yeah.
And then the mind is like such a great showcase of that too, and how it just like makes the whole game around communication. Like there's a
Yeah.
lot of games that have like limited communication as like some small part of it.
Like,
But in the mind, the game is just like to communicate with each other at all.
yeah. I think the mind and Hanabi both are sort of underscoring on my list of paradigm shifting games too, the importance of this idea that, right, what you can't do in games is just as important as what you can do. But oftentimes with games, all you want to learn when you're learning the rules is what you can do. And I think that both the mind and Hanabi are great examples of where what you can't do is so much more important than what you can, And that's fun.
Totally. And actually, kind of high society too, you can't spend the most money.
The most money. Yep.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, the last one I have on my list is 21, a very simple roll and write game that also kind of breaks the rules of our not picking significant games in our personal histories. But this was a game that I picked up when my family was traveling in, I think we were in Copenhagen, and I stepped into a little game shop and I wanted to get something that like I could play with my family in like our Airbnb or at a cafe, and I was kind of directed towards this like very, very slight roll and write game. It is basically in the Quicks line of games, even simpler than Quicks, with an even smaller sort of decision space. In 21, you roll a handful of dice that are colors, and you have colored boxes on your sheet, and you have to like mark off one of your colored boxes with a number in a matching die, and you're completing rows, and that's basically the whole game. You're trying to like X out the most boxes. And there's like almost nothing to it. And that therein was where the paradigm shifted for me, which was just the opportunity to play a game with almost no decision space, like almost completely random over and over again, where I realized that almost completely random, like if there's a sliver, just a smallest bit of a way to like differentiate yourself from your opponents, like to push the boundaries of that, 1 to 5% is enough for me. Like I actually love that in games, of being able to like find the smallest edges and advantages. And I think that, in some ways, this is something we've talked about a lot on this show, where sometimes our most interesting deep dive conversations come when we cover like the lightest, smallest games, because it really gives us the space to like get in there, pick them apart. And I think playing 21 specifically was the game where I sort of like realized that about myself, where it's like, yeah, it's totally random. Like, yeah, like a new player can beat a super experienced player, but as long as I'm getting better at it and I can take my chance of, winning, if I'm playing, a 5-player game from 20% to like 20.1 and then 20.2 and 20.3, like I'm perfectly happy. And that is enough to be a game that I love.
Is 21 a game where you all have the same shared inputs too?
So I'm trying to remember off the top of my
Yeah.
head. What I think happens is all this. So you roll a dice, everybody can use them,
Okay.
but the person who rolled can re-roll them.
Interesting.
So you get like that one agency point. and also like, but you can't reroll ones, and ones are really important in the game. Basically, the boxes will all have a number in it, and you can only enter a number that equals that or smaller. So like you want to
Ones
hit
are
like
really valuable.
bullseyes as much as possible.
Yep.
But if you can't take anything or choose not to, you have to like cross off your biggest number available
Interesting.
to you. So there is decisions to be made absolutely, and like, when do I put this 1 into a 5 so I can just like keep moving on? 'Cause as soon as somebody finishes, that's it.
Yep.
So there's a lot to like weigh there, but also there's a lot of like, hell yeah, blue 5, let's go.
This is a complete aside, but I think you love games where everyone has the same shared input and then makes their own decisions based on those input.
Yeah,
I
I think
think.
so. I think
Yeah.
that's something I definitely get into.
Interesting. Okay. So that's 21.
Yeah, it's
A,
called 21, like spelled out.
a roll and write game. Very cool. Okay. My final paradigm shifting game is a game that we covered on Decision Space in episode 59. In my mind, this is not one of the early games we covered, but in
It's
history,
weird when
it
we think
is.
when I like we referenced like the CT win episode recently.
Yeah.
Like I was actually having dinner with some friends who are like back in town, and someone was asking about the podcast, and not a big board gamer. So I was thinking like, oh, I'm gonna recommend the CT win episode, and that's like episode like what 60 something,
67.
and now we're on
Yeah.
like 150. It's like,
Pretty
dang, we need
wild.
to maybe something to think about, more and good entry point accessible episodes.
Yes. But this
Okay.
game, again, episode 59, came out in 2016, and it's Uwe Rosenberg's A Feast for Odin. So the reason why A Feast for Odin was a paradigm shifting game for me, and this is a game that I first played in prepping to cover it on the podcast, so that I first played in the last few years, I think it has a lot to do with the scope of the game and also what the game asks of you in terms of the obstacles it puts in front of you. So A Feast for Odin, if you don't know, is this massive worker placement game that offers over 50 worker placement locations. It gives you just gobs of workers that you get to gush out on the table. And you also have this player board in front of you that you're just trying to fill up with differently shaped pieces that are just tiles. That it's kind of like, people call it Viking Tetris. It's not quite that, but it's something along those lines. And I think for me, the biggest thing about A Feast for Odin is I had always thought of really heavy strategy games as a necessary component of them being that they're just complex and chewy in a way that you produce this chew through having really difficult obstacles to overcome. That a lot of the struggle in the game is struggling against the mechanisms that are going to constantly push back against you as a player, or you're going to be constantly pushing up against one another at the table in terms of conflict. And I think, interestingly, a lot of A Feast for Odin, there is some of that. You're competing for sort of limited shared player locations, but none of it is all that complicated or all that crunchy. It's just big and delicious. The game also does put up some obstacles that you need to overcome. There's a certain amount of needing to sort of feed your Viking clan every round that is sort of inspired by one of Uwe Rosenberg's other games, Agricola. But in A Feast for Odin, the game kind of gives you everything that you would need to be able to accomplish that goal at the start of the round. So I think we actually titled this episode, The Feast is a Lie, or something along those lines.
Yeah.
And for me,
Classic title.
yeah, it's a good title. That to me, Jake made it, but that to me is almost the paradigm shift, is sort of how games can sort of trick you into thinking you're overcoming some huge obstacle while also kind of being the wind in your sails that you think you're pushing yourself there. It's just a nice little like twist to the game where it sort of says, no, like, you're not here to struggle, you're here to celebrate, right? Like A Feast for Odin is kind of like the chance of you getting to like write the song of your like Viking clan without a lot of difficulty in terms of doing that. Like the difficult thing is doing the puzzle way more efficiently than everyone else at the table without any huge obstacles to bump up against in a lot of
Yeah.
ways.
No,
Yeah.
that's well said. Yeah, if you want to emigrate, go for it. If you want to explore, go for it. If you want to
Yeah.
go whaling, go for it. Like you're probably gonna have a pretty good time doing any of those things. You
Yep.
might not win the game, but you're gonna like advance no
Yeah.
matter what.
Yeah. And I think that flexibility and that openness is really what the paradigm shift was for me.
Yeah, so that's really interesting because I think you're right in that so much of like heaviness gets conflated with like struggle,
Mm-hmm.
right? And here it's like not, it's just bountiful progress.
Yeah. Something
Yeah.
like, and to give an example of something like that, right? Like Barrage is a good example where I'm constantly have nothing. I'm just struggling to ever have the
And
resources
even
I
when
need to do anything.
there are times in that game where you're like, oh my God, I'm doing it. It's happening for me. Like,
Yeah.
but yeah, you're right. And it feels like when you're going into that game, you're like steeling yourself for like, this is going to be a big challenge.
Yeah.
And everybody's going to screw me over as much as
Yeah.
possible.
In Barrage. Yeah.
Yeah, in Barrage,
Yeah.
where in Feast Road, and it's just like, ooh, what am I going to choose to explore this time?
Yeah. In some ways, it's like two diametrically opposed, awesome, heavy game. Yep.
Cool. Well said. Brendan, this was a really fun conversation about paradigm shifting games. Do you have any final thoughts? I had a final question.
Okay.
Did you consider, and we don't have to like name names here, but did you think when you thought about paradigm shifting games, did you think of like, I realized I don't like this type of game when I played X? Because I was kind of thinking about that too. Like I was like, I don't tend to like, I could almost say like Cosmic Encounter for me was like, and that was when I realized I probably don't like, strictly speaking, negotiation games.
Interesting.
You know, I was just like so psyched. I'm like, yes, this is like the greatest game ever, according to Shut Up and Sit Down. And finally, I'm going to play it. And then like, oh, this
was not for me. Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting. I think for me, that didn't come to mind as much because I was trying to think about not necessarily just taste, but how I think about how games could exist. Are we covering Vadis next year?
Next year?
Yeah.
Oh, like as a deep dive? Like
Yeah.
more Vadis covered?
Yeah.
I don't think the good people at Bite Wings Games want me to talk about Vadis anymore, but I'm sure they'd be delighted for you too.
We'll balance each other out.
Yeah, maybe you and Jared cover it.
No, I need your perspective. You say this, but both times we played it, you were having a blast.
I was so mad that second time we played it, dude. The first time I was like delighted because I was like, now everyone has to see what I see.
And then we all loved it and wanted to play it again. And you were like, what?
And then the second time we played, I was just so pissed. I was went full like hostile. I was like, I'll rule with fear, and that went horribly, as you would expect.
My most recent play, I completely misjudged who was winning to the point that I've never misunderstood a game state war. So TBD. Anyway, yeah, that has nothing to do with paradigm shifting games.
Yeah. Okay, awesome. Well, I think that brings us to the end of this week's episode. Brendan, thanks for bringing the topic to us. Listeners, thank you so much for sticking with us to the very end of this episode. As always, we so very much appreciate you. If you want to leave us a review, we haven't had one in a while. That goes a long way. Or just tell somebody you know about our show. Like, we want to keep growing, and you can obviously help us do that. So thanks so much.
And also, if you just have a few spare minutes, as a reminder, we'd love for you to participate in our annual rankings. So go to decisionspacepodcast.com/rankings. And I think, Jake, let's just leave it there. Great. Right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sounds
Until
good.
next time.
We should thank Embry for intro and outro song Reach Out. And thanks for listening, and have a great week.
Bye, y'all.
Bye.